Okay, here we go. First review session. And I've got the screen up here. This is our first page. It's broken up into thirds. In the first 20 years of this time period, 54 to 74, is called Imperial Wars and Colonial Protest, right? And it all stems from how the 7 Years' War, leads to an end of this salutary neglect and then leads to colonists starting to feel that their traditional rights as freeborn Englishmen are no longer being recognized by the crown. And there is not open rebellion yet, but a series of events are put into motion where all of a sudden now colonials no longer feel the same affinity for the crown, because what is the magic word of the Revolutionary era? It starts with an L. That's right, liberty, right? And remember, when we talk about liberty in the context of the British tradition, we're talking about two things. We've got the positive definition of liberty, right? The ability to participate, sometimes referred to as political liberty, right? I have a right to participate in the political process. That is something that we're not going back before period 3, but the colonies to some extent had a form of representative government. Representative by our definition today? Absolutely not. But in the context of 1754 in the world, are you kidding me? Right? Again, when you take that woman's class next year in European history, you'll get a review of what you learned in 9th grade. You know, this is the exception in the world to have people participate, even a limited few white men owning property, participating in government, as opposed to anywhere else that you saw in the world. So let's go ahead through this. So as we talk about imperial wars and colonial protests, right here, this is the big one, right? The 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. And there were 3 colonial wars before this, but between France and Great Britain, but they all started in Europe and spilled over to the colonies. And they were costly and they were expensive, but the European powers were about settling affairs in Europe, and what was happening in the colonies was kind of a sideshow, right? Now, all of a sudden, in 1754, we are going to have a 4th and final showdown between the French and the British for who is going to rule North America. And as we have talked about, this is an event that happens right here in our own backyard. The governor of Virginia sends George Washington, it's Governor Dinwiddie, sends George Washington with a small detachment of men to check French expansion in the Ohio Valley. They are, of course, building what fort? That's right, class, Fort Duquesne. And you know the story from, probably 5th grade history, where Washington and his Indian allies ambushes a detachment of French soldiers at Jumonville. Washington then does one of the all-time greatest military gaffes of all time and builds Fort Necessity, where he is captured, but he is then released. Suffice to say, that starts a war that goes all the way until 1763, and it's different. Britain is not going to rely on colonials fighting this war. Britain sends the full weight of her army, and it's the British army, again, assisted by colonial militias, fighting the French regular army, again, with militia and Indian allies, and it is a decisive British victory. When Quebec falls, right, you have a capitulation by the French. And look, again, we're trying to think big ideas, okay? Big ideas. I'm sorry if I got lost in the weeds, okay? There's 3 minor wars before this. They focus on Europe. This is the big one. It started in the colonies, and it's going to determine the fate of the colonies. It's longer, it's more expensive. The British government goes all in pushing its resources. The British win. They win control of all of North America. However, all of a sudden now, Britain is really broke, and there's no free lunch. There are extremely high taxes in Britain to pay for this. Now, the colonists we talk about perceptions, right? Why does this stuff matter? Colonists felt like they played a major role in winning this war. They were very proud of that. And they were suspicious of some of the heavy-handed tactics the British used, such as trying to control colonial militias, trying to tax, right? Britain, on the other hand, sees the colonists as a bunch of jabronis living out in the sticks. They're extremely upset that it was difficult to get taxes from colonial legislatures to help pay for this war. And they did not feel as if the colonial militia was very professional. And they won the war in spite of their colonies. The colonials did have a feigned effort, the Ben Franklin Albany Plan of Union, which sort of proposed one colonial government to help fight the war. However, as we talked about during the drafting of the Constitution, under the Articles of Confederation, there were 13 sovereign states, 13 sovereign political entities. That was very difficult to end in 1787, let alone all the way back in 1754, so the plan fell apart. So to try to pay for this, right, and again, this is more minor stuff here. George Washington, as we look at, one of the reasons he gets to play a role in the American Revolution is because, one, he's Southern, and Massachusetts is desperate to bring along somebody from the South to this largely Massachusetts cause, although he does not really distinguish himself. In fact, he is routed with, not only at Fort Necessity, but then with General Braddock in a failed attempt again to take Fort Duquesne. The Peace of Paris is what gave Britain control of North America, but now they have to pay for it. Now they are going to end this salutary neglect, where there were laws on the books, navigation acts, very strict laws that basically gave Britain a monopoly. Remember mercantilism, right? The colonies exist for the benefit of the mother country. And the navigation acts were laws that prohibited smuggling. The British colonies could only trade with Great Britain. Well, now that stuff's going to start to be enforced under the reign of King George and the ruling party, the Whigs, right? As Parliament is going to pass a series of laws ending salutary neglect, right? And the very first thing that we see is, as we go up here under American Indians, Pontiac's Rebellion. The French had a very good relation with the indigenous Indians. And when Britain won and took control of French possessions, they ended the same cooperative practices, mainly it's giving gifts, okay? And all of a sudden now there is further British colonial settlement west. Remember, this is an age of land being everything. Is there any opportunity to get land in Europe? No, nowhere, right? And as more people come to the colonies as they grow, you've got to face north, turn left, and go west to have that opportunity to own land. So Pontiac was an Indian chief that led an organized rebellion that attacked the western frontier from Pennsylvania all the way down to Virginia and into the Carolinas, even, I remember correctly. And the British Army has to put it down, and it's very difficult to put down. As a result of this, now here, they passed the Proclamation of 1763, which draws the boundary of Western British colonial migration to the Appalachian Mountains, like basically where we are now. And this causes a huge uproar because here we have, the one thing, remember, life is really hard and dangerous here in colonial America. And it's way more hard and dangerous as you go west, but people brave that because it is that opportunity to own your own land. But what we start to see the real problems come from is here. I know I'm partially blocking it. The Sugar Act of 1764. Now we are going to start to see the British Parliament starting to collect money from the colonies, enforce the Navigation Acts, and pass additional laws so that they can control, so that basically they can have the colonies pay for themselves, pay for the cost of empire, and pay the massive war debt that the British experienced during the French and Indian War. So the Sugar Act is just what you would think. It had a tax on sugar as well as some other goods. But it was a massive effort to enforce the Navigation Acts and cut down on smuggling. In addition, you now had, if you were charged with smuggling, you had to not be tried in a local trial by jury, right? But rather, right? But rather, you are now tried by British judges in British courts, not a trial by jury. Okay. As a result of that, we start to see colonists talking about, and I'm sorry, I just want to make sure that I don't go anything out of order here. We start to see colonists think that liberty is being threatened. We are seeing increased economic control with the Sugar Act, but more importantly now, if you are accused of smuggling, you are being denied that right to a trial by jury. You are being tried by a crown-appointed judge. The Quartering Act provided for the colonies providing housing for British soldiers, as you are going to see an increased British military presence in the colonies during this time to enforce these acts. And while the Sugar Act started to stir up a hornet's nest, right, why am I looking there? I can look right here. It is the Stamp Act that really gets things going, because now we have an internal tax, right? Basically anything that had a piece of paper, from a newspaper to any license to any legal document to playing cards, right, required this stamp. This is something that had always been used back in England. This was nothing that was new, but all of a sudden now it is a far removed British government, a government in which there is no colonial representation, passing now an internal tax. Not a tax paid by merchants at port, right? But rather a tax paid by the final consumer. So now you start to see this. You have Patrick Henry denouncing this in the Virginia House of Burgesses, claiming that this is a violation of traditional British rights. If you are going to be taxed, you have to have some type of representation in government. And again, there's no colonial representation in British Parliament. And you have the Stamp Act Congress, where we have different colonies coming together to try to figure out a way to resist this new direct tax placed by Parliament on the American colonists with no representation. Now, eventually, the Stamp Act Congress is about the idea of boycotts and non-importation. You saw, especially in Massachusetts, the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, where now you had crowd action. You had people, breaking into the customs houses. You had people breaking into, the stamp collector's residence, office, burning stamps, tarring and feathering stamp collectors. It was not super effective, but rather an organized effort to not buy British goods convinced Britain to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766, but passed the Declaratory Act, which said that Parliament had the right to rule the colonies in all cases whatsoever. That's that concept of virtual representation. Parliament speaks. While there's no colonial representative in Parliament, Parliament speaks for the entirety of the British Empire, which is what folks like Patrick Henry, John Dickinson, Adams, and Otis, right, do not believe in. They believe that the British government is defying their liberties by taxing them without their consent. This was something that was not done, again, under salutary neglect, until we saw the huge war debt from the French and Indian War. So now we move on and pass the Townsend Acts the next year. And this is really important that it doesn't tax that many things. Tea, a few other luxury items, I think glass. But what's really important is it provides for these writs of assistance. Now, remember back in 9th grade AP Civics, where you learned about the protections for search and seizure in the Bill of Rights. Well, under the Townsend Acts, all that the British authorities needed was a writ of assistance. It was a general license to search anything that they thought might have to do with smuggling. It's not like in the case where you learned in civics where you think that there is some illegal activity. You have some sort of probable cause. A judge issues a warrant to search something specific pursuant to some specific crime. No. If you had a writ of assistance, it gave you a license to search anyone, any place, anything, anytime if you suspected it of smuggling. And again, this is seen as a violation of traditional rights of freeborn Englishmen. And so you start to see John Dickinson's Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer urging colonial resistance. And then Adams and Otis writing the Massachusetts Circular Letter, asking Parliament to reconsider this, like they did the Stamp Act. And like Dickinson said, okay, this is not a direct tax, but you're still taxing the colonies with no consent. This can't go. And not only that, these Townsend Acts, in addition to creating these writs of assistance, and this is not on the study guide, the Townsend Acts were designed to collect revenue to pay all colonial royal officials so they could become completely independent of colonial government, as they were paid now by the British government. And not only do we have this Massachusetts Circular Letter, which is shot down by the ruling authorities in Massachusetts, the royal authorities, but we start to see committees of correspondence emerge after this, in which now people from different colonies keep in touch to say, hey, are you seeing the British government do anything that is a violation of liberty? So as the Townsend Acts are eventually repealed, the Tea Act remains in effect, where there is, it's like a token measure. Okay, we're not going to have the same taxes under the Townsend Acts because, again, there was colonial economic resistance, and as we talked about it many times in capitalism, money talks. But the Tea Act was symbolic in that tea could still be taxed. And of course, you learn the story in elementary school. It exempted the British East India Tea Company. Basically not exempted, but it subsidized the British East India Tea Company, so that all of a sudden now, even if you smuggled in Dutch tea, which you wouldn't have to pay a tax on, the taxed tea from the British East India Company was still way cheaper. So the idea was, all right, we're still going to tax tea. Like, you got off on everything else, colonists, but we can still tax you. And we're gonna provide an incentive that you buy this tea that we have taxed because we have subsidized. And remember, government subsidy is where the government defrays the cost of production. We are subsidizing this cheap tea. So you're going to buy the cheap tea, and it's cheap even though it's taxed, so you're going to pay the tax. Oh, well, that didn't go over too well. And you all learned the story in elementary school of the local hotheads in Boston, Sons and Daughters of Liberty, deciding they were not going to pay this tax. And before the tea could get offloaded, they threw the 300 and some tea chests into Boston Harbor. And now we see Lord North, right? What did I want to remember to tell you about him? Oh, Lord North, who had passed the Tea Act and repealed the Townsend Act, now comes down with the absolute hammer, the Coercive Acts, collectively called in America here the Intolerable Acts, right? Now we are getting closer and closer to overt acts of rebellion. This should say Port Act. Sorry, right? The Port of Boston is closed until it pays for the property damage of the T. Because again, you're taking private property. This is a private company subsidized by the government and destroying their property because it symbolizes Britain's right to tax you. And again, larger context, you are saying, listen, I have zero representation in Parliament. This is a violation of my traditional British right to this positive political liberty to participate, or to at least have people from my community. I may not be able to hold office, but the rich guy down the street who hears my concerns is able to hold office. So the Port Act closes Boston. The Massachusetts Government Act takes power away from the elected colonial legislature and puts it all in the hands of a royal government, right? And the Administrative of Justice Act, again, allows for people that are charged with crimes against the crown being tried by the crown, not by a local trial by jury. And finally, the Quebec Act. It doesn't seem like much, but it was like, oh my God, Britain does not reflect our colonial interest. Basically, we'd be on the border of Quebec right now. It expanded the province of Quebec into the Ohio Valley, which again, colonists saw as limiting future British expansion in there. And the Quebec Act also recognized Catholicism as the official religion of Quebec. As we talked about in class when we got to Irish immigration in the 1840s, the colonists were not too keen on having a Catholic state, especially ones that boundaries now was into the Ohio Valley. So things have gotten bad. And before we close up here, this stuff's really easy, guys. But again, as I tried to couch it to you in the traditional rights of Englishmen, the positive and negative definitions of liberty. Positive, I can participate in the process. Negative meaning I have certain individual rights, such as the right to a trial by jury. I have an unreasonable search and seizure. And all of these things down here contribute to that traditional rights of freeborn Englishmen. The idea of the Enlightenment, the reliance on reason, the rejection of superstition and rationalism. Everything has a scientific explanation. I'm not sure why they put deism in here. Remember, deism is where the divine power sort of starts everything, but God does not play a hand in day-to-day affairs. Just think of it more in terms of again, rationalism and the idea of natural rights. Certainly that contributes to the idea of freeborn Englishmen, which goes all the way back again. All right, you want to take it back to the Magna Carta. It's a slippery slope. I'm not going to get to that, but just think about, remember the English Bill of Rights in the wake of the Glorious Revolution. And then you have ideas of social contract. And again, with John Locke here, social contract with Rousseau and John Locke, the idea of governed by consent. There are certain rights that are inherent. And again, the government just doesn't rule because it is ordained by God, right? Divine right? Rather, it must serve the public interest. So I think I covered everything in there. I hope it was not too long-winded. And I hope that not only do you recognize what each of those things are, but you can put it in the larger context now.